Professor Krill'nax had been teaching galactic military history for 73 cycles, and in all that time he had never once required emergency sedation during a lecture. That record was about to end. The Verdanian scholar stood before his class of promising young cadets from across the unified systems, his three eyes scanning the attendance roster with growing dread. 200 students from 47 species, all eager to learn about the great conflicts that had shaped their corner of the galaxy. And there, highlighted in the ominous red that indicated special protocol requirements, was a name that made his primary heart skip several beats. Marcus Webb. Human. Earth Sector 7. Oh no, Professor? Chirped Tessik, a bright Avarian student whose feathers were currently displaying the soft blue of contentment. Are you experiencing a medical emergency? Your chromatic oscillation patterns suggest severe distress. Krill'nax forced his skin pigmentation back to a calm orange, though every instinct screamed at him to flee the lecture hall. I am functioning within normal parameters. Tessik, thank you for your concern. Liar, his subconscious helpfully supplied. You are absolutely not functioning within normal parameters. He had attended the mandatory briefing, of course. Every educator in the unified systems had been required to complete the 17-hour certification course titled Human Integration and You Surviving the Experience. The course had been illuminating and terrifying. Mostly terrifying. The door to the lecture hall slid open with a soft hiss and Marcus Webb entered. He looked so ordinary. Standard height for a human. Approximately 1.8 meters. Brown hair cropped short in what Krill'nax had learned was a military style. Eyes that held a peculiar gleam that the professor was beginning to recognize as the human expression for "I'm about to make this everyone's problem." Sorry I'm late, Professor. Marcus called out cheerfully, dropping into a seat near the front. Had to finish filing incident reports from yesterday's combat simulation. The Verdanian's teaching tentacle trembled slightly. Incident. Report? Yeah, apparently using the environmental controls to flood the enemy position wasn't within the spirit of the exercise. The human shrugged, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both apology and complete lack of remorse. Who knew? 17 other students from various peaceful species immediately requested transfers to different sections. Krill'nax couldn't blame them. Right. Well, let us begin. He activated the holographic display and a star map flickered to life above the classroom. Today we will be discussing the contested border wars of the Third Epoch. A fascinating period of military strategy. Oh, this is going to be good, Marcus muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. The professor's eye stalks swiveled toward the human. I'm sorry? Nothing, Professor. Please continue. Suspicious. Definitely suspicious. Krill'nax pulled up the first tactical scenario. The conflict began when the Morthath hegemony disputed mining rights in the Tharos Nebula. Rather than engage in direct combat, which both sides wished to avoid, they agreed to a series of limited engagements over a period of 8 standard years. 8 years. Marcus's hand shot up. No. Please. No. Yes. Cadet Webb. They fought for 8 years over mining rights. Without actually trying to win, the conflict was carefully managed to minimize casualties and economic disruption. Well, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Shocked silence filled the lecture hall. Students from civilized species gasped at the breach of academic etiquette. Tessik's feathers had gone shock white. Even the Krellian students, who were known for their aggressive nature, looked scandalized. Krill'nax felt his teaching career flashing before his eyes. Cadet Webb, the Morthath-Talos Accords are considered a masterpiece of civilized conflict resolution. Minimal bloodshed, economic interests preserved, diplomatic channels maintained throughout. Sure, if you like wasting 8 years and probably trillions of credits on a problem you could solve in 8 days. And how precisely would your species have handled it? The professor regretted the question immediately. Marcus grinned, that terrible, terrifying human expression that showed far too many teeth. Oh, by the void. What have I done? Well, first we'd establish clear strategic objectives. Control of the mining operations, right? So you need to deny the enemy their ability to extract or transport the resources. Day 1. You map all the approach vectors to the nebula. Day 2, you mine every single one. Mine them? Squeaked a Poffling student from the back row. Space mines. Yeah, make it so expensive and dangerous to approach that it's not worth their while. Meanwhile, you establish a forward operating base on one of the nebula's outer asteroids. Something defensible. Krill'nax was taking notes despite himself. The entire class was leaning forward. Day 3, use fast attack craft to harass any enemy vessels that try to enter the operational zone. Nothing too aggressive, just enough to make them nervous. While you're doing that, You send a diplomatic delegation offering to split the mining rights 60-40 in your favor. That seems reasonable, offered Tessic tentatively. It's a bluff. While they're considering the offer, you're secretly surveying the nebula to find the richest deposits. Day 5, you redirect your mining operations to those locations exclusively. Day 6, you leak that information to the enemy through intelligence channels you've let them think are secure. The Morthes student, Krill'nax, raised a tentacle. Why would you inform them of your advantageous position? Marcus's grin widened. Because now they think they're facing an enemy who has already secured the best resources and is willing to negotiate. The psychological pressure is enormous. Most governments would accept a 40-60 split at that point rather than fight for possibly inferior mining sites. And if they don't accept? Krill'nax heard himself ask. Day 7, you demonstrate your capability by intercepting and boarding one of their mining vessels. Not to harm anyone. Just to prove you can. You let the crew go with a message that you have complete operational superiority in the region. Day 8, you offer the split again. This time with a deadline. This is barbaric, shrieked Apophling. This is efficient, Marcus corrected. 8 days versus 8 years. Minimal actual combat. Maximum strategic pressure. The key is convincing the opponent that resistance is more costly than cooperation. Krill'nax's teaching tentacle had stopped trembling. In fact, he was scrolling through his notes from the actual Morthath-Talos conflict with growing horror. The hegemony eventually agreed to a 45-55 split in favor of Talos after 7-4-3 years of limited engagements. There you go. I got you better terms in 8 days than they managed in 8 years. The classroom erupted in argument. Half the students were horrified by the humans' casual approach to warfare. The other half were frantically recording every word. Their academic interest clearly piqued despite their moral reservations. Order, please. Krill'nax's skin flashed a commanding purple. Cadet Webb, while your analysis is disturbingly practical, you're overlooking the societal importance of prolonged, carefully managed conflicts. They provide opportunities for military officers to gain combat experience in controlled environments, allow for economic stimulus through military contracts, and get people killed for no good reason while politicians and defense contractors get rich. Uncomfortable silence. That's a cynical interpretation. It's a human interpretation, Professor. We've done the whole endless war for profit thing. Learned our lesson the hard way. Several times, actually. Turns out it's much better to fight wars you actually intend to win, as quickly and efficiently as possible, than get back to peace. Krill'nax pulled up his next example, determined to find something that would stump the problematic primate. Perhaps you'll find the siege of Krill'nax station more complex. The defending Yultarian forces held the station for 14 months against overwhelming odds through brilliant use of defensive fortifications, and Marcus's hand went up again. Why do I even try? Yes, Cadet Webb, they had the station completely surrounded, right? No supply lines in or out. Correct. The Yultarians subsisted on recycled water and emergency rations for over a standard year. Well, so why didn't the attackers just wait? I mean, if you've got overwhelming force and total control of the surrounding space, you don't need to attack at all. Station can't go anywhere. Just park your fleet at a safe distance and wait for them to run out of food. That would be. Krill'nax paused. Actually, that would have been significantly more efficient, right? Instead, they launched 17 major assaults, lost thousands of troops, and eventually won by attrition anyway. If they'd just waited, they would have achieved the same result with 0 casualties. Krill'nax the Morvath raised a tentacle again. But where is the honor in that? Where is the test of military prowess? Honor doesn't bring dead soldiers back to life, Marcus replied flatly. And military prowess is demonstrated by achieving your objectives with minimum cost to your own forces. That's the whole point of strategy. The lecture hall had gone very, very quiet. Krill'nax realized he was losing control of the narrative. Time to deploy the big one. The conflict that every species in the unified systems agreed was the pinnacle of tactical brilliance. Very well, Cadet. Let's discuss the Battle of Tharos. Surely you can find no fault with Grand Admiral Vexen's masterful coordination of, the one where he divided his fleet into 17 separate task forces to attack different enemy positions simultaneously, a maneuver that is still studied as the height of tactical coordination. The precision required to synchronize 17 independent operations across a planetary system was completely unnecessary and nearly cost him the entire battle. Tessic's feathers had gone from shock white to a rather alarming shade of crimson. Several other students appeared to be experiencing their species' equivalent of a nervous breakdown. I beg your pardon? Krill'nax's 3 eyes narrowed dangerously. Marcus stood up. walking to the holographic display with the casual confidence of someone about to ruin everyone's afternoon. Look at the positioning. Vexen divided his forces because he wanted to appear overwhelming from multiple directions, right? Psychological warfare through demonstration of superior coordination. Very impressive. I'm glad you can appreciate. Except he split a fleet of 300 ships into 17 groups of approximately 17 ships each. Math's not exact because of varied task force compositions, but you get the idea. Now look at the enemy positions. The human manipulated the display, highlighting enemy defensive installations. They had 6 major defensive clusters protecting Tharos Prime. 6. Not 17. By splitting into 17 groups, Vexen guaranteed that most of his task forces would be engaging empty space or minor defensive satellites while only 6 groups faced serious opposition. Krill'nax felt something cold settling in his stomachs. The coordination required was a waste of resources. A better strategy? 6 task forces, each one specifically tailored to counter one defensive cluster. Use your remaining ships as a mobile reserve to exploit breakthroughs wherever they occur. You maintain tactical flexibility, you don't overcomplicate your command structure, and you can actually support your attack groups if they run into trouble. The professor pulled up the actual battle reports. The ones he had read 100 times. The ones that were currently making him feel like his entire career had been based on fundamentally flawed assumptions. Admiral Vexen's 17th Task Force was nearly destroyed because they encountered an unexpected enemy cruiser squadron. Marcus continued, highlighting the relevant section. If he'd kept a mobile reserve, he could have reinforced them immediately. Instead, he had to pull ships from 3 other task forces, disrupting their operations and nearly causing a cascade failure in the entire battle plan. He won the battle, Krill'nax protested weakly. He won despite his plan, not because of it. The enemy made even worse tactical decisions, so his mistakes didn't matter. But against a competent opponent, that overcomplicated nonsense would have gotten everyone killed. The bell signaling the end of class chimed, but nobody moved. Marcus returned to his seat, looking entirely too pleased with himself. Sorry, Professor. I know I'm supposed to just listen and take notes. It's just, some of this stuff seems so obviously wrong that I can't help myself. Krill'nax stared at the young human for a long moment. Then he activated his personal communicator. Security? This is Professor Krill'nax in Lecture Hall 7. I need to request an emergency war counselor for tomorrow's session. Acknowledged, Professor. May we ask why? The Verdanian looked at Marcus Webb, who was now cheerfully chatting with Cesic about optimal siege tactics. Because I've just realized that everything I've been teaching for 73 cycles might be catastrophically wrong, and I need a professional to help me process that information before I have a complete psychological breakdown. There was a long pause. Is there a human in your class, Professor? How did you know? Lucky guess, we'll have someone there first thing tomorrow morning. Krill'nax disconnected and slumped in his teaching podium. One lecture. Just one lecture with a human student. And already he was questioning decades of military scholarship. Tomorrow's class was going to cover the Great Pacification Campaign. He was definitely going to need that war counselor, and possibly several strong intoxicants. Professor Krill'nax arrived at Lecture Hall 7 the next morning to find that word had spread. The classroom, designed for 200 students, now contained approximately 470 beings of various species, all crammed into every available space. Students hung from the ceiling supports. The species that possessed such abilities, others had brought personal hovering platforms. 3 Morthath scholars had apparently teleported in from the administrative offices upstairs, and standing at the back of the room, looking far too calm for Krill'nax's comfort, was Counselor Yumara, a synthol specialist in human-related psychological trauma. She wore the distinctive silver sash of her profession, and carried what appeared to be emergency medication dispensers for at least 12 different species. Good morning, Professor, she said, her voice carrying the practiced serenity of someone who had seen terrible things and learned to cope. I understand we have an interesting class ahead of us. That's one way to describe it, Krill'nax muttered. He noticed that Yumara had positioned herself near the emergency exit. Marcus Webb entered right on time, took one look at the packed lecture hall, and grinned the terrifying human grin. Wow, did I miss a memo about Bring Your Friends Day? Your reputation precedes you, Cadet Webb, Krill'nax said dryly. Apparently footage of yesterday's lecture has been circulating through student networks. You've become something of a celebrity, or a cautionary tale, added a Krellian student who had wedged himself between 2 seats in the 3rd row. Marcus shrugged and found his usual spot. Happy to entertain either way, Professor. What's on the agenda today? Krill'nax took a deep breath through all 3 of his respiratory organs. Today we discuss the Great Pacification Campaign. the largest coordinated military action in unified systems history. 87 member species working together to suppress the Vorgan warlord confederacy. A shining example of cooperative military doctrine and, "Oh boy," Marcus said, pulling up the campaign details on his personal display. "This is going to be painful." Counselor Yumara dispensed a preemptive calming agent to herself. The professor activated the tactical display showing the massive scale of the operation. The campaign lasted 6 standard years and involved coordinated actions across 43 star systems. Through careful planning and respect for each species' cultural approach to warfare, the unified systems managed to lose approximately 4 million soldiers while fighting an enemy that never fielded more than 600,000 troops at any given time. Dead silence. Krill'nax's skin turned a dangerous shade of crimson. The Vorgan Confederacy was highly entrenched and motivated. Their guerrilla tactics were exceptionally effective against conventional forces. Sure, but you had 87 species contributing military assets. 87. Do you know what the problem with that is? Diversity of tactical approaches? Offered Tessic, whose feathers were already turning anxiety purple. 87 different command structures, 87 different languages, 87 different cultural attitudes about warfare, 87 different logistical systems that probably weren't compatible with each other. Marcus pulled up a subsection of the battle reports. Look at the third battle of Corvus Station. You had Poffling units refusing to attack during their rest cycle, Morvath forces insisting on formal honor challenges before engaging, and Krellian ships breaking formation because their commanders wanted individual glory. Calix the Morvath bristled. Honor in combat is not negotiable. No, but timing is. You had forces literally waiting for other forces to finish their cultural requirements before coordinating attacks. The Vorgans were outnumbered 10 to 1 and they still won that battle because the unified systems fleet couldn't act like a unified fleet. Counselor Yumara was making notes. Lots of notes. What would humans have done differently? Krill'nax asked, knowing he was going to regret it. Marcus stood, approaching the holographic display with an energy that made several students lean away nervously. First, unified command structure. I don't care if you have 87 species involved. You pick one species' military doctrine as the baseline and everyone else adapts to it. You can preserve cultural elements in training and ceremonies. But when you're in combat, everyone follows the same tactical playbook. That's cultural erasure, protested a Poffling student. That's survival. War isn't about expressing your cultural identity. It's about achieving objectives and protecting your people. If your cultural practices interfere with that, you modify them for the duration of the conflict. Marcus zoomed in on the Vorgan defensive position. Second, you assess your enemy's actual capabilities, not their potential ones. The Vorgans relied on hit-and-run tactics, right? Quick strikes, then retreat to fortified positions in asteroid fields and nebula clusters. Correct, Krill'nax confirmed. Their mobility was their greatest asset. Then you deny them that asset. You don't chase them. You blockade every system they operate in, establish sensor networks they can't bypass, and cut off their supply lines. Guerrilla forces need resources. No food, no fuel, no ammunition means no guerrillas, a Yultarian cadet raised appendage. The Vortigans had sympathizers in multiple systems who provided them with supplies. Then you find those sympathizers and you cut the pipeline. Intelligence operations, not fleet engagements. You make it clear that supporting the Vorgans has consequences, not brutal ones. You're not monsters, but economic sanctions, travel restrictions, trade limitations, make it more profitable to cooperate with the unified systems than to help the enemy. Tessic was frantically recording everything. So were about 200 other students. Third, you establish clear victory conditions. What does winning actually look like? Unconditional surrender? Regime change? Dismantling of military capabilities? Because I'm reading these reports and it seems like different member species had different ideas about what they were trying to achieve. Krill'nax pulled up the official campaign objectives. Then he stared at them. Then he stared at them. Some more. By the voice. The Morvath contingent was fighting for territorial concessions. The Poffling forces wanted humanitarian intervention and the Krellian fleet was seeking punitive damages for previous raids. Exactly. You had 3 completely different wars happening simultaneously under the same banner. No wonder it took 6 years and cost millions of lives. How long would Earth forces have needed? The question came from the back of the room. A small Verdanian student, barely old enough for academy enrollment. Marcus paused, clearly calculating. Full pacification of the Vorgan Confederacy, assuming cooperation from unified systems for intelligence and logistical support. 8 months. Maybe 10 if they had better defensive infrastructure than these reports suggest. The lecture hall erupted in disbelief. "Impossible," roared a Krillian admiral who had apparently joined the audience without Krill'nax noticing. The Vorgans controlled 43 systems. They operated in 43 systems. They only controlled about 7. Look at the actual population centers under their governance. Maybe 2 billion beings total, spread across a dozen planets and 50 orbital habitats. Marcus highlighted the relevant data. You established naval superiority in those 7 core systems first. Cut them off from the other 36 systems where they only had raiding parties and sympathizers. That immediately reduces your operational area by 80%. The admiral looked like he was experiencing a religious crisis. Then you offer terms. Generous terms, actually. Full amnesty for rank-and-file soldiers, fair trials for leadership, economic development aid for Vorgan worlds, representation in the unified systems government. Make it clear that cooperation leads to a better future than resistance. And if they refuse? Ymira asked, genuinely curious now. Then you demonstrate overwhelming force in a limited, controlled manner. You take out their command and control infrastructure, their weapons manufacturing, their fleet coordination centers, not their civilian populations. You're not trying to hurt people, you're trying to break their ability to wage war. Then you offer terms again. That's remarkably restrained for what we've heard about human military doctrine. Krill'nax admitted. Marcus nodded seriously. The best weapon is the one you never have to fire. The best battle is the one you never have to fight. Humans learned that the hard way. We spent thousands of years killing each other before we figured out that winning isn't about body counts. It's about achieving your political objectives with minimum cost to everyone involved. But humans are famous for their ferocity in combat, objected Krill'nax. Sure, when we fight to win. Quickly, efficiently, decisively. But we'd rather not fight if we can help it. Diplomacy backed by credible military force is way better than actual war. Marcus pulled up another section of the Great Pacification campaign. You know what this whole thing needed? One really good diplomat, and the visible presence of a fleet capable of glassing planets but unwilling to do so unless absolutely necessary. That's essentially extortion, muttered a Pothling. That's deterrence. There's a difference. Extortion is demanding something in exchange for not hurting you. Deterrence is demonstrating that cooperation is better than conflict while maintaining the capability to defend yourself if needed. Counselor Ymira stood up, drawing everyone's attention. I think this is a good moment to pause and process what we've learned. Cadet Webb has presented several alternatives to established military doctrine that are challenging to traditional understanding. You mean he's ruined everything we thought we knew about warfare? A Morthath student said flatly. That too. Yes. Krill'nax slumped in his teaching podium again. I've taught military history for 73 cycles, published 14 books on tactical analysis, received the Distinguished Scholar Award from the Unified Systems Academy of Strategic Studies, and a 23-year-old human has just systematically dismantled my entire life's work in approximately 2 hours. Marcus looked genuinely apologetic. I'm not trying to be disrespectful, Professor. Your analysis of what happened is accurate. It's just that what happened was often really inefficient. Inefficient, Krill'nax repeated. Millions died because we were inefficient. The weight of that statement settled over the lecture hall like a shroud. Tessic raised a wing tentatively. Professor, may I ask Cadet Webb a question? At this point, why not? My entire worldview is already destroyed. The Avarian student turned to Marcus. If human military doctrine is so superior, why hasn't Earth conquered the galaxy? Every eye, stalk, sensor, and optical organ in the room focused on the human. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was different. Older somehow. Tired. Because we remember what it was like when we conquered each other. We remember the empires that rose and fell on Earth. The kingdoms that slaughtered millions for territory and resources. We remember 2 global wars that nearly destroyed our entire species. We remember the dictators, the genocides, the weapons that could end all life on our planet. He looked around the room, meeting the gaze of students from dozens of species. We learned that military power without restraint leads to horror, that winning at any cost eventually costs everything. So when we finally reached the stars and met all of you, we made a choice. We'd share what we learned about fighting, but only if you understood why we try so hard not to fight. The silence was profound. Humans are really good at war because we're really tired of it, Marcus continued. Every tactic I've described today, we developed it by making terrible mistakes and watching people die. We got efficient at violence because we desperately wanted less of it. Does that make sense? Krill'nax realized his teaching tentacle was trembling again, but for different reasons this time. Yes, Cadet Webb, that makes perfect sense. Ymira stepped forward. I think this is an excellent place to end today's session. I'll be available for counseling sessions for anyone who needs to process what we've discussed. Professor Krill'nax. The word please. The students filed out slowly, many of them arguing in clusters about tactical theory and strategic philosophy. Marcus was immediately surrounded by admirers and critics, all demanding answers to increasingly complex hypothetical scenarios. When the room finally cleared, Yamara approached the professor's podium. How are you holding up? I'm not sure, Krill'nax admitted. Should I be updating my entire curriculum? Probably. But not because everything you taught was wrong, because it was incomplete. She gestured at the now empty lecture hall. You taught your students what happened. Cadet Webb is teaching them what could have happened. Both perspectives are valuable. He makes it sound so simple. Simple isn't the same as easy. Humans have the advantage of learning from centuries of catastrophic mistakes. They compressed thousands of years of military evolution into a relatively short period because they nearly destroyed themselves multiple times. It gave them perspective. We're only beginning to understand. Krill'nax pulled up his lecture notes for the next session. Tomorrow I was going to cover the siege of Tralloc 7. 3-year siege, celebrated for the defenders' endurance and creativity. Let me guess. The humans would have resolved it in 3 weeks. Probably 3 days. Knowing Cadet Webb, the professor made a decision. I'm going to revise my entire teaching methodology. Present the historical facts, then ask Webb to provide human tactical analysis. Turn it into a comparative study. Yamara smiled. That's an excellent approach. Just make sure you keep me on standby. You're worried he'll cause more psychological trauma. I'm worried he'll be right, and that's much more traumatic than being wrong. The counselor gathered her supplies and headed for the door, pausing at the threshold. Professor, for what it's worth, the unified systems needed this. We've been at peace for so long that we forgot why we study war in the first place. It's not about glorifying conflict. It's about understanding it well enough to prevent it. After she left, Krill'nax sat alone in the empty lecture hall, staring at centuries of military history that suddenly looked very different. From the hallway, he could hear Marcus Webb enthusiastically explaining to a group of students why orbital bombardment was almost always the worst possible tactical choice, despite its apparent efficiency. The professor's communicator chimed. A message from the Dean of Military Studies. Krill'nax. I've been reviewing recordings of your lectures. We need to discuss expanding the Human Tactical Analysis program across all military history courses. Also, please confirm you still have access to counseling support. Several other professors are requesting similar assistance. The Vordanian scholar looked at his 73 cycles worth of carefully researched, peer-reviewed, academically celebrated tactical analyses. Then he opened a new file and began typing. Military History Curriculum Revised Edition, Chapter 1. Why everything we thought we knew about warfare was probably inefficient, and what we can learn from the species that figured it out the hard way. Outside, Marcus Webb was explaining combined arms doctrine to an enraptured audience of cadets from 17 different species, none of whom had any idea that their entire understanding of military strategy was about to be revolutionized by a species that had only joined the Galactic community 30 years ago. Krill'nax permitted himself a small smile. Maybe teaching could still surprise him after 73 cycles. Even if the surprises came with mandatory psychological counseling.